to see Mr. Barnier on Monday, the European Union's chief negotiator. And whilst he was very polite and it was all very formal, and we talked about what had been agreed so far, and he was very happy with what the British government's given so far. And so we move on to phase two. We move on to talks about trade. Those talks, of course, don't start till March. I did ask him why it couldn't happen sooner. I was told it was for technical reasons. But the trouble is, the deadline, and these things can shift, but the deadline at the moment for these trade talks to finish is October of this year, leading into a series of ratifications through all the 28, because we're still a member Parliament states, and then at the end, the European Parliament too gets its view. So time actually on trade is pretty tight. The impressions I got were, well, when it comes to selling motor cars, wine, chocolate, cheese, he's mega relaxed. Of course the United Kingdom can have a deal along the lines of Canada or the one that's now being talked about for Japan. And if you think about it, that's not very surprising, because they do sell us every year £70 billion worth of goods, more than we sell them. But when I moved the conversation on to services and financial services, there was a distinct stiffening of his body language and kind of a, this just isn't possible. So I left that meeting pretty pessimistic about us having an all-round, grown-up trade deal. Not pessimistic business-wise, because actually I'd much rather our financial services industry was able to have different rules, different regulations and be competitive. But pessimistic because ultimately it's the British Parliament. If you remember, big concessions being given, won by Parliament against the government. It's Parliament in the end that will have its say. And my position now is I think that Barnier will put a deal forward that it is very likely our Parliament will reject. If that happens, there is a constitutional crisis. And barring an immediate general election, and my goodness me, May calling an election, that really would be turkeys voting for Christmas, I do believe that a second referendum is now a very real risk. I want to make it clear, I don't want one, but I'm facing up to the fact that it could happen. And I'm saying to my fellow Leavers, where have you all gone? You've disappeared. We're not making the arguments. The other side are making the arguments. So am I right to fear that second referendum, or have I got it completely wrong? Let me know, folks, what you think by calling 0345 6060 973. You can, of course, if you think I'm paranoid, text to 84850. And I'm being joined today in the studio by firstly Alistair Cambell and secondly Lord Adonis. So do you know what? If you want to send them some messages and ask them some questions, you can do so on Twitter. Use the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. You can watch us on Facebook Live and comment there too. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce pro-Remainer, perhaps even Remainer-in-Chief, former Director of Communications with Tony Blair and Editor-at-Large for the New European, Alistair Cambell. Good morning.
Hi, Nigel.
Now, I noticed that your old boss and colleague Tony Blair is kind of back in politics in a way, isn't he? And he's really saying that, as I understand it, that the Labour Party ought to change its position and ought to become, I guess, really a pro-referendum party at the next general election.
I think certainly, I mean, it's really interesting to hear you talking there and to see your stuff in the Observer today, where you seem to feel that the Remain side has got its act together and the Leave side is falling apart. I have to tell you, it doesn't feel like that to me. But I think what is happening...
What, you mean that the Remain side is not as well organised as I fear?
I think you are a bit paranoid about that, if I'm being frank. I wish,
well, that's the first bit of good news I've had this morning.
I wish there was. And I certainly wish that the Labour Party in Parliament was reflecting what I think is a real anxiety in the country about where this Brexit is heading. I think where you're right to be concerned, and I think this maybe is a result of your seeing Barnier last week, I think there is a growing sense amongst the British public that this deal isn't going to be a good deal. I don't think we were ever going to get the so-called exact same benefits that we have now. We're leaving the biggest trading area. If we leave the single market, if we leave the customs union, I think we're going to do fundamental damage to our business. And I think people are sensing that. And I think from my perspective, I mean, look, I've been trying to push this line on the Labour Party. Let's get tough on Brexit, tough on the causes of Brexit, to go back to one of our older...
I'm amazed that you're reheating that one.
Well, do you know what? It was tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. But I'll tell you, let me just explain what I mean by that. Tough on Brexit in that if the country does decide, do you know what, this is not what we thought we were going to get, this is really not going to do us any good, but this is where I think both Labour and the government are, in a sense, failing in their democratic duty at the moment, not really addressing those issues that led people in the first place to say, do you know what, I'm fed up with this.
Well, and, you know, it's interesting because I listened to the Remain argument, and you and I have been debating this ever since the referendum, and you always talk, Alistair, about economics. You always talk about saying you think leaving the single market,
yeah.
You know, leave it.
No, but actually, that's what I'm saying now.
But the real point, surely, is this. You know, your hometown, Burnley, is very classic of many of those northern parts of this country, traditionally Labour areas, but who voted to leave. And there was one issue, wasn't there? One issue that really motivated people to go to the polls, and that was getting back control of our immigration policy.
I don't think you can say there was just one issue.
Well, the key issue.
Right, there's certainly, but that sense, and now what I think a lot of people are feeling, I'm actually from Keighley, not Burnley, but I was with lots of Burnley fans yesterday at
Selhurst Park,
losing
to Crystal Palace.
Yeah, and Crystal Palace deserved to win, I'll give you that. But I think what people are starting to think is, OK, yes, it was as this sort of feeling about getting back control. That was the sort of genius of that line, take back control. And what's happening now is people feel actually, well, it's not happening. We were told this was going to be fairly straightforward. We were told that actually the costs were going to be minimal. We were going to get more money for the health service. It turns out we're getting less. We're going to get money back from Europe. It turns out we're going to have to pay in 39 billion to get it back. And business, I think, is really, and yes, you're right, maybe we focus too much on the economic argument, but the economic argument is fundamental to this. If people start to worry that we're going to be worse off as a result of Brexit, and I think we already are, by the way, not just looking at the value of the pound, you look at the budget with growth forecast down for 5 years. I think we're being kept afloat by the growth of the world economy rather than our own. Inflation going up, food prices rising faster than they've done for 4 years.
Didn't we hear all this? Didn't we hear all this from you 20 years ago when you were one of the key advocates for us joining the euro? All the same arguments.
No.
That outside, prices would go up, investment would drop.
No, but prices are going up.
The City of London would collapse. I mean, you gave us all this on the euro, and you were wrong then, weren't you?
Well, first of all,
do you admit that you were wrong about wanting us to join the euro?
Well, first of all, as you know, I'm still very close to Tony Blair, but if you read my diaries, volumes, whatever it was, I was never quite on the same page as him on the euro. That's the first thing. Me personally.
But you worked next with him every day for years.
Because he was my boss. He was my boss, and I did what he wanted.
Let me rephrase that then. Was Tony Blair wrong when he said we should join the euro 20 years ago?
I was not as enthusiastic as he was. But listen, you
was he
just
wrong?
say, wait a minute, Nigel, you just said...
You're asking me to believe, right?
No, but I'm asking you to look at what's happening now.
Yeah, fine. So you're
not
asking
predictions.
You're asking me to believe...
This is happening now.
When Blair says it'll damage us,
no,
when you say it'll damage
us,
us, I'm saying to you, your track record on this isn't that good.
I think our track record actually is pretty good, given that over the period of a Labour government, I think up to the crash, I think you'd have to say we had a pretty good record. My point is this is happening now. The pound, the devaluation of the pound, which is having effect on health spending, on defence spending, on all of these other things, a growth forecast where they've actually said for the next 5 years they've downgraded our growth forecast. That's our own government, and OK, you can say the forecasters get it right or wrong, but that's their assessment. The health service... And what's happening there? I think it's in the paper that you're in today, The Observer. There's a story alongside it about the ambulance recruitment going down, nurse recruitment going down. This is happening now.
I would accept,
not just the predictions.
I would accept that we have a population crisis, that with the population rising by 500,000 a year, our health services are struggling terribly to keep up. But on this point of the pound,
we're not focusing on it.
And again, I keep hearing this argument about the pound. You know, the pound started falling in 2010. It fell far further between 2010 and the referendum than where it is now. The pound is down a bit from the referendum, but hey, it's bounced quite a lot. So I'm not buying into that.
It really hasn't. I mean, well, look.
Well, it's 135 against the dollar. It was down at 118 after the referendum.
We can. I think people get fed up, people just batting around the stats. But all I'm saying is when the pound fell as it did, that wasn't a sort of technical readjustment. That was the world markets, which exist whether we like them or not, saying this is what we think is going to happen to the British economy. It is going to go into decline. And I think it is. Now, you can say, well, you said this before, you said that before. Yeah. But I think if you look at what is happening now...
I look at foreign direct investment at a record level last year. I look at manufacturing, the best it's been for 30 years. I look at UK growth higher than everybody, including our own organisations here, predicted.
No, hold on.
I mean, look, it may not be...
Australia. We've gone from the top of the G7 to the bottom.
We are growing at 1.8%. It may not be. It may not be electric, but we're growing. But let me ask you, let's get back to the Labour Party on this, because they are the opposition. And ultimately, if I'm right... If I'm right to fear, and you would cheer, but if I'm right to fear a second referendum, it would be because the deal, ultimately, that is agreed with Barnier, gets rejected by the House of Commons, all right?
Well, and that will happen if it's a bad deal.
I know it will.
Right.
And that's the feeling I've had
surely, wait a minute, Nigel, but surely that is right. If we voted for something that was promised, where we were going to get great trade deals, we were going to boost our economy, get more money for the health service, all these things that we were promised. If it turns out we're getting none of that, surely the public is entitled to say, do you know what, I want to have a think about this again.
That is a failing of the government as opposed to a failing of Brexit. I mean, I was very, very struck.
Yeah, but the government's in charge of Brexit.
I mean, the meeting with Barnier. Well, yeah, and you have a cabinet of 25 people
who don't agree on everything.
17 of whom were Remainers.
So 18 months Nigel.
I was very struck that immigration. What I asked Barnier about immigration, and what had been agreed thus far, he simply said, "This is all for the future." So it's not surprising that there are people getting on the Leave side, getting very, very frustrated that they're not getting the kind of action and kind of delivery. But the Labour Party, your party, stood in that election back in June. They couldn't have been clearer. They said that vote for us and we will take you out of the European Union, out of the single market, and take back border controls. They're now not saying that, are they? Haven't Corbyn's Labour been very dishonest with the electorate?
Well, democracy in elections, as you know, they're complicated processes. I voted Labour. I've always voted Labour all my life. But in terms of Brexit, the reason that I was absolutely motivated to vote Labour, even though I knew that was in their manifesto, is I felt the only way to stop Theresa May getting a mandate for the hard Brexit, I think it was a UKIP Brexit.
What could be harder than the Labour manifesto?
Because we had to stop her getting that mandate. So I keep saying to the Labour Party, to Keir Starmer, Jeremy Corbyn, as you may know from these non-GQ interview, doesn't want to talk to me. But Keir, I will say, lots of people voted Labour, not, if you like, for the words in the manifesto. No, I'm sorry, but that's the fact.
That hardly gives us great trust in politics, does it?
Nigel, you said in the paper today, in the Observer today, you think there's a majority in Parliament against the Brexit that's being put forward. I hope that's true, because I certainly think there's a majority against it in the country at the moment.
That I don't agree with you about at all. I think the opinion polls show that 68 to 70% want the government to get on with that. I tell you what, this is unfinished business, and we're going to return in a minute. Am I right to fear a second referendum, folks? Alistair Cambell is going to stay with us, and he will take some of your calls. So put what you want directly to Alistair Cambell. You can do it by calling 0345 6060 973. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 10:17. Monsieur Barnier's made me very pessimistic about the deal. I think it's quite deliberate, actually. In fact, I think there's actually collusion going on between the Remainers, the Ramoners, as I call them. I've got one here with me, Alistair Cambell. He didn't agree. He thinks I'm paranoid. Hey-ho. But I'm really worried that deal could get vetoed by Parliament. That could lead us to a second referendum. And, yeah, we're going to take your questions. I'm just going to ask Alistair Cambell two more things. Firstly, Alistair, is there a deal? Is there a deal that David Davis could come back with that you would find acceptable?
I don't think there's any deal that will give us what he's promised, which is the exact same benefits as what we have now. And so I think it's highly unlikely. And also I think maybe what you were picking up possibly with Barnier, I think there was a point at which the Europeans felt, do you know what, the Brits are serious about trying to get something that does get us both to the best of both worlds, if that's possible, which I don't think it is. And I think they're picking up the noises from the government, who I think are actually far closer to your position than you're letting on. I think that they're thinking, the Brits are not serious, and they probably are starting to play much harder ball.
So, how hard will you campaign for a second referendum?
Well, I hate this phrase, a second referendum, and I'll tell you why. We've had a referendum and we lost and you won. I accept that. But I think that what we're seeing is the public becoming more and more anxious, despite both the main parties, as you said earlier, heading in the direction of this has to happen. The public becoming more and more anxious as they realise that the deal that we may get is not going to match up to their expectations of what Brexit was going to be. So I see it as possibly a general election and/or a fresh referendum.
A fresh referendum?
On the question, on the deal. A fresh referendum, yeah.
Yeah,
and not a question of campaigning for that. Look, I've made no bones about it, Nigel, since June the 24th to 2016. I think if you feel as I do, that this is a catastrophe for Britain, for your kids, for future generations, and what Britain is going to be as a country, I think you have to fight that, and I'm going to carry on fighting.
Are you excited about the United States of Europe? I mean, they're going to have a European army by 2025. They're going to have foreign policy without veto by 2025.
No.
Juncker's also said
I don't come at this.
No country would be exempted from Schengen or the euro. Does that prospect excite you?
Not terribly. I don't come at this from a pro-European perspective. I come at this from a British perspective. And you talk about patriotism, and we talked about the value of the pound. I'm sure you know lots of people at the MOD as I do. They are really, really struggling at the moment on defence procurement because they're having to cancel orders. We're flogging frigates to the South Americans. So our defences are being eroded, in my view, because of Brexit.
If you were to win, and we were to revoke Article 50, and we were to stay part of the European Union, are you prepared to accept the terms that Mr Juncker has set out to a standing ovation in Parliament, that we must all join the euro, we must all join the European defence community? Would you accept those terms?
No. And
well, you can't have it both ways.
No, wait a minute. I think this is where you're wrong, Nigel, because I think what I think, and actually you mentioned Tony Blair earlier, the paper that he produced on the Global Institute website recently, I honestly think people should read it, because I know people like to shoot the messenger, but he's got a lot of interesting things to say. But I think my real worry about this is that Brexit, if it does happen, and I'm actually pessimistic on the opposite to you, I think it is going to happen, and I think it is going to be a disaster. But if it happens, the ideal outcome to me is that Brexit actually is used as leverage for real reform in Europe, and I think that actually the Europeans are keener on that than you give them credit for, particularly Macron.
You know, if the European project was to become cooperative, where nation states genuinely work together,
which I think they do,
I'd have no problem with it. It is the fact that European law is made by the Commission, and we the voters can't change it. And enough of me. Let's go to the public. Elaine says to me, Campbell's back on the economy. We voted for immigration control and sovereignty. And Campbell can't answer how we deal with these while still in the European Union. So if we stay in the European Union, how do we get immigration controls? And I think you would accept the public want that.
I think they do. And also, I think she's being unfair, because when I talked about tough on Brexit, tough on the causes of Brexit, what I meant by that was actually we do have to address those concerns that people expressed.
How?
Whether that's housing, whether that's immigration. Well, I think, you see, back to the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn seems to be saying that the reason why he's come to this kind of, pro-Brexit position, I think he's always historically been Eurosceptical, we know that, but is that he says that there were lots in his manifesto that he wouldn't be able to do as a member of the European Union, and I just don't believe that. There's far more that we can do.
Well, you can't nationalise the railways as a European Union member, so he's got a point there. But let me get back to this. How could you control immigration as a European Union member?
You can look. You've got a situation now. You take Northern Ireland there, right? So you can either have hard border, hard Brexit, or you can have freedom of movement.
Let's not complicate this with Ireland, because Ireland's always complicated in any of these debates.
Even though we were told at the end of phase one that it had been resolved, which it hasn't.
And important, and the Irish Taoiseach is coming to Strasbourg this week. I'll be in debate with him on Wednesday. But do you not accept the fact that it's pretty much impossible to control the numbers coming to Britain as a European Union member?
And we're going to continue. What your side has done, though, Nigel, you've actually, I think, been fundamentally dishonest about this, because we're going to have continuing difficulties in controlling immigration.
We can do as we wish as a free country.
No, but you may be able to do that, and then you do have to address the economic downside.
I think you're ignoring this. Let's go to Vicky in Croydon. Vicky, good morning.
Hello, how are you?
I'm well. What would you like to put to Alistair Campbell?
Alistair, do you ever think that maybe the like Barnier and the other people sort of like doing the sort of talking about where we're going to go in the future, do you not think that they might be manipulating the situation a little bit so that they throw us into a bit of a tears, so we end up having to have another referendum in the hope that we would vote to remain?
This is, Vicky, a little bit what I was saying. Are they colluding with Remainers in this country to try and force us into it?
I mean, there's part of it that says I wish they were.
But no, that's honest.
I don't think so, Vicky. I mean, I think that what's really interesting about watching these negotiations, you've got our government, one government with effectively 4 different camps within the cabinet, even 18 months in, failed to agree a strategy against Barnier representing a pretty united collection of 27 countries. I think they're trying to make the best of a bad job. I genuinely think that's the case. I think at the start they would have liked to have imagined that Britain might in the end stay. I think they've moved beyond that, and that's why actually I'm pessimistic in a way that Nigel ought, I think, to be optimistic.
You satisfied with that, Vicky?
Well, to be honest with you, as somebody who voted leave, I'm pessimistic the other way, definitely.
Oh, well, I'm cheered by that.
I strongly believe that we will not leave in any meaningful way. Even without another referendum, I'm saying another referendum to sort of like, to sort of appease both of you. I do believe that.
I don't want another referendum, Vicky. I just want us to leave. But
I want us to leave.
But Vicky, Vicky, when I went through earlier those things about inflation going up, and I'm not saying it's all because of Brexit, but let's say that some of it is, or defence orders, or the health service, and the lies that we were told about that. Has nothing happened since that has in any way made you a little bit troubled?
No, and the reason being, because of the flip side, you said earlier on that you weren't happy with the idea of a massive army, etc. That's the route we would go down if we remained, and there wouldn't be much choice in the end about that.
I think you're right. Vicky, I thank you. I'm going to take... Time is very tight. Helen from Wandsworth, we haven't got much time, but I know you've got a very important question to put. Good morning.
Good morning. I would like to ask whether you think that the Labour Party is committing suicide by completely ignoring or trying to destroy the outcome of the referendum.
I don't agree that. Actually, I wish the Labour Party would move on this to a much more anti-Brexit posture. I agree there are political risks, but I think that if what the Labour Party has to do, I think, is understand the reasons why people voted leave and address those concerns in the context of explaining that those concerns are not going to be helped by Brexit. And one of the real worries I have about Brexit, Nigel says that the leavers have all scattered and gone to the winds. The ones who seem to me to be really still fighting hard for Brexit on the political landscape are what I would view as the hard right in the Tory party, UKIP, what have you. And I think that a lot of the people who voted leave in working class areas, particularly in the north of England and some of the poorer parts of Scotland and Wales, I think they are the ones who are going to get hardest hit.
Helen, I'm going to come back. We're going to do more of that question, because I think there are 4 to 5 million Labour Brexit voters out there that Labour could lose if they go down the Blair-Campbell route. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's now 10:30. Well, much to my surprise, Alistair Cambell and I are having an almost civilised conversation here this morning, and he's agreed to stay because he wants to take your calls and your questions. So without further ado, I'm going to go to Frank in Eastbourne. Frank, good morning to you.
Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
I've got a question for Alistair.
Yep.
Yeah, he keeps coming on saying about the value of the pound. The pound has dropped. But in 2008, the pound was 102. There's 102 to the euro. And in 2015, it went up. The pound went up to the value of 144. So currencies go up and down all the time. And just before the referendum, the pound was overvalued. Most people said it was overvalued. So why does it keep going on about that? The other question, if I can, about the money going to the NHS, it was never going to go to the NHS until we actually left the EU. It wasn't going to the day after we voted out. It wasn't going to go to the...
Frank, you've put 2 very clear questions to Alistair. Alistair, you're wrong about sterling, because actually it oscillates. And it's been falling for some time. No, I mean, that's a statement of fact, and you're absolutely right. Currencies go up and they go down, but I think that the reason, as I said earlier, for the pretty profound devaluation that happened was because the markets were signalling what they felt would be and feared would be the impact long term upon the economy. And I think, yes, I was never a great fan of the whole sort of Project Fear, the world was going to end and so forth, but I do think there has been fundamental economic damage, and I think that will continue. Bear in mind, as you say, we haven't actually left. This is signalling what the markets think will happen. Added to which, the other reason why I get, business I know has a very difficult job to do because they don't particularly want to fall out with government, but when you have a situation where only 2% of British businesses, according
according to the Chamber of Commerce, actually want to leave the single market. When you have I know people sort of like to dismiss the CBI as just being about big business, but they are very, very important players in the economy, that they have real, genuine concerns that if we get pushed towards this no-deal scenario, that is literally going to be a cataclysm for our economy, then, you can't just dismiss that.
Well, that is their position, but of course it was interesting to see, wasn't it, former CBI Director General and former Trade Minister under a Labour government, Digby Jones.
Yeah, well, you can find
who's reached a different view. Alistair, I'm going to go back to this pound argument just quickly.
Yeah.
The day before we left the European Union, when all the polls said we'd stay,
we haven't left yet.
Sterling dollar was 143. It's now 136. I'm going to rattle on through. Peter is in Wimbledon. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning, guys. Thanks for taking the call. My question to Alistair is, while it is understandable that people on the Leave side never kind of warn us about so-called benefits of our financial sector losing EU trading passports or having Irish border reinstated, we hardly heard people on the Remain side talking about things like this. And those decisions, like those issues, are very, very important, and they have the biggest impact on the British economy because, as you know, financial sector is the biggest contributor.
80%, yeah. Listen, I totally agree with you, and I'm not going to sit here and defend every aspect of the Remain campaign, because in many areas it was absolutely terrible. One of the things I desperately tried to do, for example, you mentioned Ireland, during the campaign, I went to Dublin and to Northern Ireland several times saying to the Irish and to people in Northern Ireland, you've got to make more of a noise about the impact on you, because it wasn't being done in the campaign. I think the only time Northern Ireland really became an issue in the campaign was when Tony Blair and John Major went there to draw attention to what they saw as potential difficulties for the peace process if we did end up with a hard Brexit and a hard border. So I totally agree with you. I'm not defending the campaign, but I think what's happening now, and this is I think it's great that you're having, these sorts of questions are coming up on a programme like this, because I think we're having the debate now that frankly we should have had during the referendum about real issues that are going to affect the future.
Did Project Fear, in a sense, backfire in the end?
I think it did. I think what happened was that David Cameron, in a sense, fought the last campaign. It was the same as the Scottish referendum campaign. It was the same as his election campaign against Ed Miliband. There was no kind of hope. There was no positive sort of message about Britain and Europe.
Remain told us that if we leave, it'll be a disaster. But they didn't tell us why staying in it would be a good thing. And I do agree with that. I mean,
I think fighting for a status quo is hard. But I think if you've had a situation where, let's be frank, David Cameron had the referendum because he was worried about UKIP and he was worried about the rise of the Tory right, and he wanted to keep it quiet for the referendum, for the election, so he said, we'll have a referendum. And he could go into that election saying, we're the only party promising you, and that helped him become Prime Minister. But look where he is now. So it was a classic... I think it was a classic confusion of tactics and strategy, but we are now picking up the pieces. And as you say, those two issues, whether it's 80% of the economy with passporting of services and the service economy being so fundamental to our future economic success, or it's the Irish question, we still haven't addressed them.
Well, I think, as I say, I take a different view on financial services. I think EU regulations damaging financial services, and we've got a chance to break free. Support coming in for Alistair Cambell. I think Brexit would be an absolute disaster. There is nothing better than being part of the biggest market economy in the world. Second referendum is a good idea. Let's go to Chelmsford, to Lorraine. Good morning, Lorraine.
Hello there. Good morning, Nigel and Alistair. I would like to ask Alistair what his opinion is of yesterday the German Foreign Minister, Sigmar Gabriel, revealed this shocking vision of the future for the EU. He has suggested that Europe, the countries of Europe, will only be able to act on a sovereign basis via the European Union. They're talking now of a centralised taxation, centralised budgets, handing out NI numbers to the European citizens, all the different countries there. And in fact, we will be handing over this country to become nothing more than a region of Europe.
Okay, no, Lorraine, and Lorraine raises those points, and I used different ones earlier, Alistair. I talked about the European army. I talked about the fact that nobody could be outside Schengen or the euro. I mean, surely at some point, you and your side of the argument have got to come clean. Which is it? Are we outside the European Union, or are we part of a full political union? You simply can't have both in the future.
I don't agree with that. You see, look, you've got a situation going. Politics, as you know, Nigel, it's complicated. It's messy. The European Union is complicated and messy. And one of the difficulties in the referendum campaign is that we were given these black and white arguments. You've got a situation at the moment where Angela Merkel didn't do as well in the election as she wanted to do. She's in the business of trying to put together a coalition government. All sorts of things are getting said during that negotiation process. And I didn't see Sigmar Gabriel's comments yesterday, but it echoes what Schulz says, and I accept that.
It echoes what everybody is saying, because they're terrified. They're terrified of what's happening in Poland, Hungary, Catalonia. This is, I mean, come on.
Rightly.
The plan is to build a United States of Europe, isn't it?
The plan, I think, I don't support United States of Europe, and also,
but if the option,
Theresa May,
and what Lorraine's really asking you, if the option is we become part of a United States of Europe, or we stay with Brexit, which in those circumstances, up against the wall, which do you choose?
OK, if it was the caricature of a United States of Europe that your side of the argument has been presenting for the last 2 decades...
And we've been right.
No, you haven't been right. You've been talking about a European army. Look, you've got Macron meeting Theresa May this week because the two defence powers... It's not black and white, Nigel, and you know that. I don't support that vision. Right, but I don't support your vision either.
Okay.
So I fight for something where Britain is a sovereign nation playing its full part within the European Union. That's what I support.
If the day comes within the European Union, let's say you win, and there's a second referendum and it's reversed and all the rest of it. I pray not, but say it is. Would you then, as a member of the European Union, if we're told it's very simple, you either join the euro or you leave, and that's what it's coming to. You know, they're going to get rid of all the exemptions.
I think it's coming. This is why.
What do you do in that situation?
This is why this year is so important, because I think if we come out, it will be very difficult to get back in, which I frankly believe the next generation will want us to, unless we then do go down that closer to United States of Europe route. But I certainly do think, in general, and I'm not saying I support everything that Sigmar Gabriel said or that Schulz says, but I do think that at a time when you've got China on the rise to the extent that it is, you've got America, which I think is going through a very, very troubled period, and where we won't be able to rely on America in the way that historically we have been, then I think it's politically crazy for us to pull ourselves out.
So United States of Europe's the future?
No, it's not, Nigel. I'm not saying that. This is what you do. You turn it into black and white.
But I think ultimately...
You fight for what you believe, but not by leaving.
I'm so used to this. I had Nick Clegg tell me, on the stage... Nick Ferrari hosted LBC Debate in 2014 when I said one of the reasons I want to leave is I don't want to become part of a European army. I think it will actually destroy
do you want closer defence cooperation?
Do you know what?
Do you want closer defence cooperation?
I want NATO to be the model, not something that is actually is tempting to replicate.
Why is Theresa May going to see Macron this week? Because France and Britain will remain the important defence powers, and we become less powerful
I very much hope
if we leave them.
But what's interesting is Clegg said that I was a dangerous fantasist. There are no plans for a European army, and sure enough, we're told it's on the table. And this is the story all the way through. Look, the callers are enjoying this so much. We're going to do one more.
Go on,
all right? We're going to do a last one. Will from Oxford, good morning. You've got the last question here to Alistair Cambell. Make it a good one.
My question kind of refers to what you were just talking about, is that essentially enormous amounts of young people, A, want to stop Brexit, and B, are very pro-European. So it seems to me that we're going to go down this path, leave Europe, but then in 15 or 20 years' time, when our generation, is on the leave, has the levers of power, we're going to go back in, but we're going to have to go back in on much worse terms.
Yep.
And it seems that we're wasting all this time, energy, and money.
Absolutely.
When there's real crises in the country, in education, health, mental health, Alistair, schools, prisons, blah, blah, blah.
Exactly.
What the hell is the point of this?
Well, just before Alistair answers that, I've raised this before, a really interesting point, that in this country, about 2/3, maybe a tad more, of the under-30s voted to remain, and there are people like Will who feel strongly pro-European. There's no question about that. What is so fascinating is across the whole of the rest of the continent, it's the opposite. So you take Italy, you take France, you take countries like that, where it's the older generation that want to stay in the European Union.
Maybe because they remember the war a bit more deeply than we do.
And it's the younger. I think the big reason is the euro. I think, had we listened to Alistair Campbell's boss 20 years ago and joined the euro, you'd probably now be a young rebel. But right across Europe, if you look at the parties on the left and right, whether it's the Freedom Party in Austria, whether it's Syriza in Greece, whether it's opinion polling in Italy. It's quite the biggest difference between us and the rest of the EU.
Nigel, we're
is
British.
The young are against it.
We're British. And we're in Britain, and if you look at a graph of the demographics of the Remain Leave, basically the older you get, the more likely you've been to a Leaver. And Will's generation, I think, are being totally betrayed. And so, and they weren't allowed to vote. Again, Cameron was so arrogant. He didn't. I think he should have made an effort to have 16 and 17-year-olds voting.
Why not 14 or 12? Or?
Because I think 16 is a reasonable cut-off point. You have to have a cut-off point, and I think it really energised the debate in Scotland in the referendum. But the point he makes as well about bandwidth, this government is focused totally on Brexit. She stood up the other day, Theresa May, said, environment's my priority. She says, mental health is my priority. She's got one priority, and that is surviving by delivering a Brexit that, as you've said before, and on this I agree with you, she does not believe in. So I think, and Will's absolutely right, a future generation, they're going to look back and they're going to say, that generation of Theresa May, Boris Johnson, David Davis, Liam Fox, and here's the other thing, Nigel, people do not trust those people on the competence level. They have exposed themselves as being so incompetent on so many issues. You've got Johnson in one of the newspapers today apparently being reprimanded at a cabinet meeting the other day because he confused Yemen and Lebanon in a discussion about the Middle East. He was talking about the Saudis attacking Lebanon when he meant Yemen. I mean, it's pathetic. But these are the people that you are saying we have to trust
mind you, the Labour
to deliver hard
Mind you, the Labour Party can't do some. So, you know, you could look at it all sorts of different ways. All I would say to Will is in 15 years' time it won't exist. You can see right across Europe the opposition, left, centre and right to this project is growing. If one day we have a completely different kind of Europe that is based on a cooperative structure.
But we're only going to get that if we stay in and fight for it, Nigel. And I think we're letting Will's generation down by saying, put up the drawbridge, leave it, and let's try and collapse the whole show.
I have a feeling that countries like Hungary are probably headed for the exit door pretty rapidly too.
Hungary? You know? My God, you talk about right-wing demagoguery. I mean, that's the sort of politics we've got to be fighting, not pandering to.
Well, actually, Alistair, I think what you'll find is that if you take away from people their basic democratic rights, don't be surprised if they move to the left or the right.
Maybe.
Because I think...
But let's not praise that. Let's fight
when we get to democracy, when we get to the point about democracy, you know, the key flaw with the European Union is once something becomes a piece of European law, there is nothing the British government, nothing the British Parliament, or nothing the British voter can do to change any piece of legislation.
As Theresa May said in the introduction to her white paper, we have always had sovereignty over our own decision-making, and we have.
Just that we gave it away. No, I tell you what, Alistair, we're having much too much fun here. I've got millions. I'm going to keep to the top of the hour. Lock the door. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It's now 10:50. Well, I'm fearing a second referendum, and it's interesting reading Andrew Rawnsley today, writing in The Observer, who pretty much, he thinks it's less likely than I do, but he makes the point here. He says, in the event that a Brexit deal is blocked in Parliament, there will be a constitutional crisis, and it's anyone's guess what would happen next. A not unreasonable conjecture is that Mrs May would have no other option but to go back to the country with another referendum. And that is exactly what I fear.
Or an election.
Well, or an election.
And Labour then would have to have a real decision to make about what position they put forward in the country.
I couldn't agree more. I think Labour have, frankly, been all over the place on this. In the general election, you know, in the north, their manifesto said to Leavers and a lot of 2015 UKIP voters, actually, let's be honest about this, you can vote for us because we're going to control borders, leave the single market, you get what you want. And kind of in London, they were saying, oh, well, it's...
Vote for us, we're the best chance of stopping Brexit.
You know, and someone, in fact, London Van Man, he calls himself here on text.
All right, looking forward
he says, Cambell has basically said that Labour lied at the 2017 general election.
No, I don't think that's fair. I think that, look, in the end, in an election, you have to make a choice about who to vote for. And I was simply making the point that I voted Labour in the full knowledge of what they were saying, but actually part of my motivation was to stop Theresa May getting a majority for hard Brexit. That's what I'm saying.
No, fine. I tell you what, rather than exploring this, because you and I have done quite a lot of talking, let's get the public, the only place on a Sunday, amidst the plethora of radio and television shows where it is politicians talking about politicians, journalists talking about politicians, and worst of all, journalists talking about journalists.
That's awful.
And there's loads of it out there. Here, it is the public. And we're going to go to Lowestoft on the East Coast. Going to go to June. June, have you got a question for Alistair Cambell?
Yes, I have got a question for Alistair. Good morning, Alistair.
Hello, June.
Hello. Alistair, do you believe in democracy?
I do, yeah.
Okay. Do you believe that Nigel Farage pulled off one of the biggest achievements in politician history? Only people like Winston Churchill could have done.
I'm not going to compare Nigel Farage or indeed any other current day politician to Winston Churchill, but I do agree that Nigel played a significant part in forcing David Cameron to have a referendum and in then campaigning for what he believes in. I do, yeah.
Right, okay. So obviously, you know, the Leave campaign, UKIP, etc., we've all really worked extremely hard.
Yep.
So let us get on with it. Let us leave.
Okay.
And let us have a crack at it, okay?
Okay.
Now, if we get it wrong, then you and your friend Mr. Blair, who has got lots and lots of money, can then afford to take the Brexiteers on, and then you get your referendum.
Okay, June, I'm going to stop you there.
Let me just say, June, that democracy did not stop on June the 23rd, 2016. I'll give you another argument about democracy. Theresa May went to the electorate at the 2017 general election specifically saying, I want a mandate for this Brexit and every vote you give me strengthens my hand in these negotiations, and the public rejected that. So democracy is a process, is not a moment, and I don't believe any more. And remember, Nigel did say before the referendum that if it was 52-48 the other way, it would not be settled.
Well,
you did say that.
I did say there'd be Tory voices moaning, but in reality there wouldn't have been another referendum for 25 years.
But I don't believe in fighting for things I don't believe in.
We're going to take one more. Matthew from Heathrow, time is very tight. You've got 25 seconds to put a question to Alistair, Matthew.
OK, Alistair, I just wanted to ask, why is Labour just sitting on the fence and not join the cross-party talks this week with the Green Party and all the other parties? Because Brexit should be cross-party.
Well, I really wish that Jeremy Corbyn had gone to that meeting, because if he really wants to help working people in this country, he does have to stand up to the fact that the Brexit is being pursued by Theresa May will damage the very people he wants to help.
OK, listen, that's that. What I just want to say... Alistair Cambell, former Director of Communications for Tony Blair, Editor-at-Large for the New European. I want to say a massive thank you for coming in and doing this. Not for me, but for all the listeners. We've examined a lot of this. I think this one will run and run in many senses. I still firmly believe that actually in the end there isn't going to be much choice with the European project. Either you're part of the United States or you're not. But that aside, thank you ever so much for coming in, and I hope at some point you come and do it again, even hearing rumours that maybe you'll be hosting some LBC shows in the time coming up, so that'll be good. And in the next hour we're going to continue this debate. Am I right to fear a second referendum? And guess who's coming in? Lord Adonis, a man I had a stand-up fight with in the week. I even called him a weasel. It all starts next.
He's a fine man.